Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Frank Jannuzi. I'm President and CEO of the Mansfield Foundation, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special Mansfield event. Before we get right into our topic of U.S.-Asia policy in the post-Trump era, I want to say a few words of welcome and explanation about the Mansfield Foundation and also about tonight's program. For those of you who are watching from QAnon, you may be wondering, no, we didn't choose the title for this event until after the election. We had to wait and see who won, just like everyone else. But we are delighted to be discussing the implications for U.S.-Asia policy of a Biden administration. Now, the Mansfield Foundation was created by an act of Congress to honor the service of Maureen and Mike Mansfield to the nation. Mansfield is probably the most important person that many of you have never heard of. He was the longest serving Senate Majority Leader in history from 1961 to 77, went on to be U.S. Ambassador to Japan for 11 years under both Democratic and Republican presidents. And the mission of our foundation is to promote mutual understanding and cooperation between the United States and the nations and the peoples of Asia. We fulfill this mission by strengthening human networks of educators and problem solvers, by convening sustained policy working groups to attack important issues like climate change, and also educating the public and folks on Capitol Hill. And tonight's event falls into that third basket of public education. I want to note that we are celebrating this year the 25th anniversary of our flagship program, the Mansfield Fellowship Program, which dispatches federal workers to live and work inside Japan. This program has trained more than 180 federal employees from 50 agencies to speak Japanese and understand Japanese culture and to work together with the Japanese government on common challenges. Now, at the start of tonight's program, I have a confession to make. I have always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. Growing up, that was the top of my list of things to do right after Formula One race car driver and jazz saxophonist. Sadly for me, those last two ambitions did not pan out, but I was steered into government service. And one of the first things I learned as a young officer at the State Department was two lessons that our three special guests tonight have also learned. And that first lesson is that if you really want to know a topic, you should write about it. Because it's not until you write about something and try to explain it to someone else that you really understand it yourself. And the second lesson is that you really want to learn about a country or a region or a topic, you must never rely on just one source of information. You need to cast a wide net. And the three superb journalists with us this evening do both of these things at the highest level. Now, Jane Perlez, joining us from her native Sydney, Australia, just completed a Shorenstein Fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She served most recently as the Beijing bureau chief of the New York Times, following in the steps of giants like Fox Butterfield. Since joining the New York Times in 1981, her string of foreign assignments has included time in East Africa, covering civil unrest and famine. She served as the bureau chiefs in Kenya, Poland, Austria, Indonesia, and Pakistan, and was a member of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for her reporting in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Jane and I worked closely together during her time in Jakarta, where she taught me a lot about the Indonesian Armed Forces and West Papua, and also a little something about courage in the face of intimidation, among many other topics. So glad to see you here, Jane.
Thank you.
David Nakamura, joining us from Washington, is White House correspondent for the Washington Post. David started at the Post as a summer intern, so internships matter. After 4 years as a sports reporter, he moved on to the local news staff. Later part of a team that uncovered high levels of lead contamination in DC tap water, and a series that won him the 2005 Selden Ring Award for investigative reporting. He has reported from Afghanistan and from Pakistan and also Japan. And like me, David is a former Hitachi Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, spending a year on sabbatical from the Washington Post in Tokyo. Last but not least, we have Dimitri Sevastopoulo of the Financial Times. Demetri covers the White House and also the Trump administration. He's interviewed Donald Trump. I think that's a rare thing to actually be able to get an interview with Donald Trump. Demetri, maybe you'll tell us about that. But Demetri of note, has served also as a US political correspondent at the Pentagon, riding around with Don Rumsfeld during the Gulf War. He has served as South China correspondent based out of Hong Kong, also Asia news editor for the Financial Times. An Irish national with a Greek name, Dimitri speaks Chinese and Japanese and passable English. He's also a guy who you want to talk to if you need to know the best Yamazaki single malt Scotch speakeasy in Tokyo, or maybe the best bar with a view in Hong Kong. So I'm really delighted to have these three superb foreign correspondents with us to discuss the implications for Asia policy of Biden's election. And I want to start with Jane in Sydney. Jane, Biden has talked a lot about build back better, and that seems to be mostly about domestic policy, but also about America is back. The notion that America as a nation committed to multilateralism and alliances will restore America's traditional position in the world under his administration, a position that Trump arguably undermined with his America first, America-centric unilateralism. I'm curious about the view from Sydney and your sense about how credible is this promise that America is back?
Well, I have to say, I think the Australians and I think the rest of Asia have seen this playbook before. You know, when Obama came into power in 2008, Obama, the Democratic administration, was going to concentrate on Asia and China after the Iraq War. And it didn't really happen. Obama ignored the big problems with China. But on the other hand, I have to say maybe Biden's victory is just in time, because this country, Australia, is in total hysteria about China. There's never been anything like it. The relationship between Australia and China is at rock bottom. Personally, I see the fault in both sides. We have a very conservative populist government here that has stoked what the Chinese have done and have really not been able to do any behind the scenes diplomacy. So they've used a megaphone rather than diplomacy. So I think it looks that the arrival of "we're back" will be a useful antidote to that if the Biden administration acts on it and does something and doesn't turn to Europe first because they say, oh, China and Asia is too hard. I mean, there is a thought that, you know, Europe's easier and, you know, we're used to that, so we'll do China and Asia later. That would be fatal. It would give China a huge more time. It would lose support here in Australia, where I think there's the American reputation is really tarnished after Trump. So there's a lot of work the Biden people can do if they do it.
It's a perfect segue to a question I wanted to put to you, Demetri, which is that if, in fact, the Biden administration can fulfill the always needy desires of our Japanese and South Korean allies. In my experience, one can never tell our allies in Northeast Asia that we love them often enough. And there's a constant fear of abandonment or of American retreat. And so if the Australians are perhaps cautiously optimistic that maybe Biden can take them out of the crosshairs of China, what about the Japanese? Are they concerned that Biden might reverse Trump's tough position on China, which was pretty welcome in Tokyo?
I think it's overall, it's probably good news for Japan. You know, one of the interesting kind of quirks of fate is that both Joe Biden, as you know yourself, and also Japanese Prime Minister Suga, neither of them drink. So when they meet in Tokyo or Washington, it's going to be a more sober affair. I think, you know, the Japanese will welcome the fact that it's going to be a more stable relationship with the US in terms of process and negotiations. They aren't going to have to wake up in the morning and check Twitter. I mean, the Japanese foreign ministry had dedicated people focused on Twitter, like many governments did. That will probably disappear. You know, when they talk to Biden administration officials and the official says X, Y, or Z, I think they'll have a higher confidence that that's actually what the president is thinking, which wasn't the case during the Trump administration. Even when a cabinet minister or cabinet secretary said something, you couldn't take it to the bank. So I think they will welcome all of that. Japanese like process, they like structure, that will be welcome. On China, I think they are concerned that while they didn't like necessarily the way Trump went about things, they did like the fact that he was tough on China. And if Biden comes in and, as Jane said, focuses on Europe, doesn't start off with the right approach on China, I think they will get worried. On the other hand, they didn't like the fact that Trump had photo ops with Kim Jong-un, and they thought that really the US looked weak when it came to North Korea. I don't think Biden is going to have photo ops with Kim anytime in the near future. So I think they'll appreciate that. So I think overall, it will be easier for them to manage the relationship. But at the end of the day, that just kind of gets you into the starting blocks. And as Jane suggested, the fundamental issues about how you tackle China, obviously North Korea, they don't really change. And so, yes, maybe you start on a better footing, but then how Biden handles those issues, how he works with allies, and how tough a stance he takes on China are really going to determine how things play out, I think.
David, China has been sort of the one foreign policy issue that forced its way into the 2020 campaign. There were very few other foreign policy issues that really seemed to get much traction. I'm curious, from your experience in Washington, do you think that there's any maneuvering room really for a Biden administration on China? Attitudes about China seem to have hardened across the board on a bipartisan basis. It's not driven by Trump, seems more driven by China. And then if you could take a stab at the tough question this evening, which is a little bit of speculation about how you think Beijing may view a Biden administration. So a two-part question: how much maneuvering room do you think Biden really has on China policy? Can he lift tariffs? Can he work with them on climate change? And then also, what do you think the feelings are in Beijing losing Donald Trump and inheriting Biden?
First of all, Frank, I want to say your dreams of being a foreign correspondent are not completely dead. The Washington Post is hiring. In fact, our Japan job has come open fairly recently, among others. So, let's send down your clips.
There's still hope.
I also am, thanks to the Mansfield Foundation, I am one of the few whom I know Mike Mansfield only because I got married in Montana, which is a little trivia. But I would say, what's interesting, I wrote a long piece of sort of assessing President Trump's China strategy, if that's what you want to call it. There were kind of two. One was, Donald Trump alone, and the rest was his administration. And you're seeing, the administration part really playing out this year, and that the hawks around Trump have found their moment, which is, of course, this coronavirus moment. I think it exposed a lot of the weaknesses about Trump's so-called tough line. We all know that because he did put a lot of faith in his relationship with Xi Jinping, and hope that in the spring, when this virus was underway, that he really put his trust in Xi. Was detrimental to Trump's own politics. Obviously, it may have cost him the election here. So I think, Trump, when people talk about Trump being tough on China, I really take, some issue with that, because I think a lot of people do. I think the Biden team does. And I think there were signals during as far back as, mid 2019, where Biden was trying to issue tougher statements about, Hong Kong or other moments when Trump was shying away from criticizing China because he was in pursuit of that trade deal. So there is some room to that question. I think one of the reasons that China made its way into the election, as you mentioned, is Trump, of course, had that as a major part of his foreign policy plank, but also because of coronavirus. And I think if anybody, would say in Washington that we shouldn't try to find a way to figure out how to work with China. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but do something more with China in a way that could be more useful in this moment of trying to figure out how to finally put an end to the virus, distribute the vaccine, and figure out how to move forward in ways of preventing future pandemics. That would be a difficult argument to make that you wouldn't be in favor of that. Same with climate change. And I think the Biden team sees an opportunity there. On trade, I think it's harder. I think Trump has set, hard attitudes in with his sort of trade strategy. I don't think everybody appreciated the way he did it, but I do think it may be hard for Biden to sort of roll that back. And Biden and the Obama administration were pushing hard for TPP. That obviously did not work out. It doesn't sound like there's talk about them trying to rejoin at this moment. It would almost be impossible to probably push that through Congress at this point. And I think as much as Biden talks about working with allies in that regard, I do think they're going to have to figure out how to approach China on this trade matter. I think Biden had an interview today with Jane's former colleagues at the New York Times, talking about he would not roll back tariffs right away. He's got to take stock of the overall relationship. But I think what people got to remember when Biden says America's back is that Trump's not really going away. We can see that he may really not want to go away. He may leave the White House, but he's going to be shooting from the sidelines. He's going to be a major player, and he's going to be trying to influence this debate and really maybe blow up whatever Biden's going to try to do. And even if he tries to get Republican support in Congress, it could be difficult with Trump criticizing him from the sidelines. I think you got to remember that I think allies in China see that America's politics are far from fixed at this moment. America's politics are not back. In fact, I think they're going to be in more trouble in this next several years than they even are now, and it's going to be difficult. And I think Biden's going to face one other problem, which is, how many balls can you juggle? China is a very important question, but there's a lot going on in the United States that Biden's going to have to tackle in a very short period. And so how much emphasis he's going to give in his first 2 years to Asia, to China, to working with these allies, it's going to be important, and he's got people around him who understand it. But I think he does have a challenge in sort of managing his priorities.
David, you paint a picture of a Washington that may really not be able to muster the same strength of a unified voice, that every administration wants to have, especially in the conduct of foreign policy. What does that mean, Jane, in terms of even how the Beijing government is likely to view a Biden administration if they observe that it's one that is being constantly nipped at the heels by a Republican opposition, led by Donald Trump?
They'll be thrilled. I mean, look, if Biden can't get his act together and they can't do something quickly and show their presence in Asia, it's over. Forget it. It's over. I mean, China is hacking away at the American presence in Southeast Asia and in Northeast Asia, day by day, hour by hour. And there's a huge vacuum, which is only going to grow if what David says plays out, and it seems entirely likely. And I think that leads, some savvy strategists, for example, in Australia, to say, America's not going to be in Asia. In fact, one of the best strategists here is writing a book, Asia Without America. So I think what he says plays out, it's disaster. What does China think? They're delighted. I mean, they see the United States in decline anyway, and they see this political tied in knots in Washington, just further evidence that United States will not be present in Asia, and they can take advantage of it. And I would say that in 10 years' time, China will dominate Asia. It's happening rapidly.
Now, David, your comment about TPP is one I agree with. But when I hear Jane talk about the place where reality must meet, resources, where a commitment for America to be back has to be matched not just by rhetoric, but by policies that reflect that commitment. It's hard to imagine a more important policy initiative than trade if one is trying to contest Chinese hegemony in Asia. And we saw recently the Chinese success at marshaling the RCEP agreement through, with Japan and South Korea joining that agreement. I see this as a strategic defeat for the United States, a failure of its own making by its inability to join TPP. But let me turn to Dimitri. Your paper and you yourself have focused a lot of attention on these international sort of trade economic architecture questions. Can America be back if America is not aggressively pushing forward with free trade agreements? Maybe if it's not TPP, at least with Japan or with ASEAN or with Taiwan and other countries in the region. Can the rebalance to Asia under Obama can that vision be realized without a strong economic trade component?
I think the difficulty is that, the willingness to do free trade agreements in Washington across the board, where the Congress or the administration has diminished. I mean, Hillary Clinton was not supporting TPP by the end of the 2016 campaign. The Democratic Party as a whole doesn't, and Republicans who used to be more pro-free trade have moved in the anti-free trade direction too. And as David said, Trump is going to be on the sidelines, taking shots at anyone who's doing this. On the other hand, Trump did get through the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada trade deal, so it's not impossible. But I think, if you look at why Donald Trump won in 2016 and, why he came closer to winning in 2020 than many in the Biden team expected, it's because of the economic problems in the US. Not just because of coronavirus and the economic fallout of the pandemic. It's because if you travel around the US and get out of the big cities and see some of these areas that have really been decimated by trade, and there hasn't been assistance from the government to help either bring back jobs or retrain or retool people, that unless Biden can show domestically that he's able to kind of put some pieces in place that will help people who suffer from, and there are negative impacts from free trade, there's no doubt about it. Unless you can show people that you're going to protect them or isolate or insulate them from those, from the fallout, then I think it's very difficult to sell free trade agreements, particularly if you're going to have a lot of people saying this is going to help China in some way or the other. So I think he's going to be hamstrung. A deal with Japan might be easier, but I think in general it's going to be very difficult. Even, Biden in that interview with the New York Times suggested that even a trade deal with the UK is not something that he's going to be running out of the gate to do. So I think we're unlikely to see any trade deals in 2021. I think Biden is going to have to do a lot at home and also rebuild alliances to kind of get communities of countries with shared values together to see if he can make some changes in the world that would then make it easier for him to sell those kind of trade deals back to the American people.
I mean, I did a lot of coverage of TPP under Obama, and if you think about it, Obama was at a point in the final couple of years of his presidency, even though he pushed TPP for several years, of he was hamstrung about what he could do legislatively, and this seemed like one thing he could do with Republicans, one final big project, it was part of this big Asia project. They tied it to China as like a hedge on China, and this would be finally something he could do and join Republicans and do it. And he got pushed, by his own party in a way with Bernie Sanders, surprise in the way he did in that 2016 campaign, to the point where right now Biden would have to hold his Democratic left coalition tightly to sort of move on a bunch of other projects that are much more important to him than something like this. And so whether Biden could even get enough Republican support now, given where Trump's taken the Republican Party on trade and divided it, it just seems really highly unlikely a big deal like this is going to be a top priority.
That seems to be a sober judgment, but I cannot contest it, David. Both of you have introduced the values question. I want to turn a little bit to values. Biden has spoken during the campaign more forcefully than in earlier parts of his career about the human rights issues in Asia, about the need for the United States to stand up for human rights in Hong Kong with respect to the mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I think in some parts of Asia, including Tokyo, this value-driven language is very welcome. But I think it's also no question but that in other parts of Asia, it's worrisome. There was a certain sigh of relief that I heard from some of our Southeast Asian partners when Trump was elected. It was sort of like, oh, thank goodness, now we're not going to get lectured, about our military coup d'etat in Thailand, or we're not going to be lectured by the Trump administration about extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. How do you think a values-driven or a more values-driven U.S. foreign policy is going to play in Asia? Will it distinguish the United States meaningfully from China in a way that will be advantageous? Will it complicate efforts to build coalitions or both? Who would like to take it? Jane, why don't you take a stab? Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I think it depends how Biden does it. I mean, to talk about the Uyghurs is definitely a positive thing. But is he going to, for example, allow Uyghurs in the diaspora to come into the United States as a signal? And beyond the Uyghurs, what is he going to do about freedom of the press? I think one of the disastrous things of the Trump administration was, for example, expelling 60 Chinese journalists from Washington, which resulted in all of us being kicked out. And I know that Biden cares about this because as vice president, he came and talked to us in Beijing when we were having a difficulty in getting visas back in 2013. So I think it'll be interesting to see if he can patch that up. And that of course is important to us as journalists, but I think it's also a signal to the wider world of Asia that he means business. So again, it depends how he does it. You know, action better than words.
My view is that, you know, Biden brings some consistency to the way he goes about his foreign policy, unlike Trump. Then I think it could work and be an important part of his policy. You know, I think there's a big part of even Biden's own party, though, who think that as much as we say that Trump's foreign policy was transactional and made human rights transactional, and it certainly was, that U.S. has always used human rights in a transactional manner, and that it's hollow, and that if anything, the 4 years under Trump kind of revealed how hollow the U.S. language has really been, and that others can talk a pretty game, but when it really comes down to it, Obama's not going to be tough either. And I was on the trip with Vice President Biden that James talks about. I was actually covering it from the other side, having traveled there with Biden on Air Force Two. That was the famous Hunter Biden trip, although don't go down that road. But, you know, I mean, and Biden did. He made a point of meeting with the Bloomberg and New York Times journalists who are having trouble getting their visas renewed. We covered that. It was a signal, but that didn't stop the Obama administration from, you know, partnering with China and doing the things we know that they were trying to do, and that made sense. So I think, you know, for Biden, you know, he has put out these statements. I think that he fancies himself in a little bit like Trump of having personal relationships, and he, you know, as Jane knows, I wrote about, you know, he was courting Xi Jinping under the first term for Obama. They put him in charge of sort of making sure that he managed the relationship with the number two in China, who was Xi Jinping at the time. They met and had reciprocal visits. And I think that, you know, I remember one of Biden aides saying that he saw, Biden later saw Xi at like a noodle shop doing sort of, you know, retail politicking. And he said, I taught him that. That was all me. You know, so Biden can't help himself when he does that kind of thing. And I think it's interesting to see how much he'll, you know, sort of his personal relationship he'll put into his foreign policy with foreign leaders, and the backslapping Biden that we kind of know or remember how much that matters. But I do think there's a big questions about, you know, how much staying power we really have when it comes to sort of these big questions about the Uyghurs and about you know, some of the atrocities we've seen in Burma and of course what's happening in Hong Kong.
I mean, one thing just to remember is that Biden, I think it was when Xi Jinping came to Iowa and Biden talked about his new friend and how Xi was a new kind of leader. But earlier this year, I can't remember if it was Iowa or New Hampshire, but during the Democratic primary, he said Xi Jinping was a thug who didn't have a democratic bone in his body. So Biden has shifted a lot rhetorically. I think the bigger issue is that, you know, China becomes more powerful and wealthier and tries to expand its influence and its reach, you know, as Jane said, minute by minute. It's a much more powerful country now than it was when Biden left the White House. And whether you're talking about freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, whether you're talking about, you know, slapping Xi Jinping rhetorically for Xinjiang or any of those kind of things, the reality is rhetoric and those kind, they don't make any difference. Freedom of navigation operations sound great, they look good, it make you feel like you're tough, but they don't change Chinese behavior. And, you know, there are only two things that can change behavior. One is military action or the threat of military action, or money. And if you look at how China is using or wielding its money in Asia, as Jane suggested, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, in the same way that Japan did in a slightly different way, you know, when it was emerging as a power, the US can counter China with money, with trade, but on the trade front, it's going to be difficult, as we've already discussed. It's going to be incredibly, almost impossible for Biden to argue to the American people that as they face the biggest economic crisis in generations, and a pandemic and everything else, that he should be spending lots of money in Asia to counter China. People won't support it, and I don't think the average Democrat or average Republican will support it. So what is he actually going to do to put pressure on China? There are other things he could do, you know, slapping sanctions on people, preventing officials from getting visas to come here. But those all have negative consequences. And if John Kerry is going to, and Frank, you worked for John Kerry and Joe Biden, if John Kerry is going to be flying into Beijing saying, we need your cooperation on climate change, and Beijing says, that's great, but yesterday you hit us over the head on Xinjiang, how is Biden going to manage that when some of the things he really wants to achieve require Chinese cooperation? And I think it's going to be very difficult to juggle all of those different competing interests. And I don't think there's a simple solution.
The question is, will China even receive John Kerry?
That's a good question.
Well, I think they will, Jane, but it's a valid question about, you know, receiving him and being receptive to his message are two very different things.
Yeah.
So he'll be permitted in, but will he be warmly welcomed, and will there be cooperation on the other end?
I'll bet that he probably won't go because he will know that the result will be very disappointing.
Well, let me pursue these two final points before we open up for questions from the floor. One is on climate change, because I don't want the discussion only to be about China. Although climate change and China obviously are deeply connected. They're the largest current emitter, and the US is the largest historic contributor to greenhouse gases. It's impossible to imagine a solution to climate change or even mitigation efforts without cooperation among the US, China, Japan, three very important players. And the Biden administration has already very explicitly acknowledged this is going to be a real priority, and putting John Kerry on a cabinet post in charge of it. And there's a lot of political muscle, I think, in the United States demanding action on this issue within the Democratic Party. So what are the chances, setting aside for the moment, I mean, not setting aside, but looking at China and acknowledging the challenges there, but you've got tens of millions of Asian people living in cities that are less than 2 meters above sea level. You know, so this is an existential threat, you know, to Saigon, to Osaka, to Rangoon, Bangkok. What are the prospects that a Biden administration will be able to energize global cooperation on climate change, especially in the Asia region? Dimitri, what about Japan? Will Japan curtail coal exports to Southeast Asia if Biden asks? And will Japan be a partner, do you think, on climate change initiatives?
I think, you know, fundamentally, most countries, there are a few exceptions, but most countries, they approach this from a national interest perspective. And if they think something is going to damage their economy detrimentally too much, they're going to be slow. And I think the difficulty is going to be, again, the whole world right now is, after they get the pandemic under control, hopefully, is going to be how do you repair the economic damage. So I think it's going to be more difficult to take certain kinds of action on climate change that might in the short term damage certain industries at the same time that you're trying to rebuild economies. I think really one of the most interesting avenues, I think, is for more cooperation and research and development in new energy technologies around the world. That's something where countries can agree on very easily, and you can create jobs, and it's a way to, you know, avoid doing things that cut jobs in the short term. So I think that's an area where, you know, somewhere like Japan and the US and other countries can do more together. But I do think it's going to be a big challenge. I think the climate change is clearly existential in the long run, but in the short run, there's a much bigger problem in front of everyone's face.
Before we go to questions from the floor, I want to hit the hard security issue of the Korean Peninsula. Biden, I know from firsthand experience with him, has long supported efforts to engage North Korea on the peace and denuclearization challenges. He supported the agreed framework during the 90s in the Clinton administration, and he supported efforts by the Bush administration in the six-party talks process. But that process has been a frustrating one, and one that usually seems to end badly. How do we expect a Biden administration to deal with the Trump administration's sort of fingerhold on trying to stabilize the Korean Peninsula. You know, the Singapore Declaration that was reached between the United States and North Korea by President Trump and Kim Jong-un seems to have at least reduced North Korean nuclear testing and long-range missile testing, but it's done nothing else. And North Korea's nuclear program continues to expand. So Biden's going to be inheriting an even worse problem than Trump did. What are the prospects for engagement with North Korea under a Biden administration? David, do you have a sense of how he
Well, we don't know his whole team yet. I would say that a couple of things. I mean, one is clearly they're going to start with trying to improve relations and trust with South Korea and, of course, Japan and other partners in the region. And I think that is something that will take precedence at the beginning. I think that personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un is not something, as Dimitri said, that you're going to see Biden do. I think they're going to. I think the biggest question, though, is what is their policy going to be from the start about how they see North Korea? We know that Obama had this sort of strategic patience idea that tried to sort of outlast them and keep the sanctions on. I think there'll be some of that, of course. Now, how much that, it may be almost past the point of no return here and start talking about managing a problem rather than ending one or, solving it somehow, because it seems unlikely now that we've seen what Trump's tried to do there, that there's going to be a lot of ways to make further progress. They can certainly keep sanctions on. They can certainly continue to, ask China to do more and others around the world to keep those sanctions tight. But, I don't know that there's any other magic bullets to try to figure out how to, prevent Kim from, continuing to improve his arsenal. I think the question is, how provocative will Kim be if he's not getting the attention that he got under Trump? To a degree, he's, not been as provocative as he had been with tests, but obviously there's been plenty of reporting and intelligence that they've continued to make improvements to and that this kind of stalemate is not necessarily useful for the United States either. So I think, the big question will be how they really sort of talk about and frame the problem there.
Thanks, David.
It's going to be difficult to do anything on North Korea without China, and relations with China are so bad. And China's willing to live with North Korea even with its increasing arsenal. So to get any meaningful reduction there seems very hard without Beijing yet again.
Jane, let me use that as an opportunity to ask you one question that you hinted that you might want to chat about in our earlier conversation before the event. It seems to me that securing Chinese support for a U.S. diplomatic initiative with North Korea requires some level of strategic trust between the United States and China. Because at its core, the Korean Peninsula problem is not just about the future of North and South Korea, but it's really also about the future of China's place in Asia and whether or not there is a U.S. treaty ally on China's borders or a neutral Korean country or a Finlandized unified Korea. I mean, there are many different futures that we can imagine, but working together with China to solve Korean challenges requires a measure of trust that I believe doesn't exist right now between the U.S. and Beijing. And you have a story sort of about that issue maybe that you might want to share before we turn to the floor.
Yes, well, I was just mentioning that I think Biden, unlike, previous incoming presidents, does have a relationship with the Chinese leader. I mean, you know better than I that he met with Xi Jinping, for example, for 4 days, which is a long time, in 2011 in China. They were both vice presidents, and the idea was to build this trust that we're talking about. And they went out to Chengdu, I think, and they took walks in the woods. And actually, Biden told this story at his meeting with the journalists. I don't know if you remember, David, but in Beijing, Biden told this story. Oh, I went walking with Xi Jinping, and out of the blue, he says, we don't like American surveillance of our coast, and this has got to stop. And Biden said, he replied, well, you're not transparent, and as long as you're not transparent, we're going to continue. And Xi Jinping said, well, if you're going to continue, then we may send some jets up to to shove you away, to scare you off. And Biden said, he replied, no, don't do that. Your pilots aren't good enough. You may end up with another EP3 incident. So I thought this demonstrated a kind of candor and a kind of closeness between the two. And I also should note that Biden greeted Xi Jinping at a State Department lunch in 2012 when Xi Jinping was still vice president, about to be president. And it was an all-star occasion. Kissinger, everybody was there, and everybody was saying how great the relationship was with China. But Biden got up and in his speech noted Beijing's human rights transgressions. And some people in the room were horrified. How could he be so rude? So I think it shows that Biden has got a kind of, he sees China for what it is, I guess. And let's hope that that is helpful in sort of pursuing the trust that you're talking about.
I appreciate that comment, Jane. And in my experience, the Chinese appreciate it when people don't bullshit them. Mm-hmm. And Biden's the same way. He doesn't appreciate, people blowing smoke. So a certain amount of candor about the difficulty of the relationship, I think, is very welcome in Beijing. And it speaks well of the ability of Biden to try to manage this challenging relationship. All right, great. We've got several questions teed up on the floor. I'm going to take one that's looking at the question about the hard security issue. It's a China question about the South China Sea. This issue strikes me as one that is more likely to be an irritant in U.S.-China relations than yield any strategic changes in the outcome. Several of you have already commented tonight that our freedom of navigation operations don't seem to change the facts on the ground. Can we expect that this might be an area where the two countries could reach some kind of modus vivendi, a la what the US had with the Soviets, certain rules of the road, to just sideline this issue and put it behind them? Or must we go through the motions of steaming frigates through 13 miles off of atolls? Anyone want to take a stab at that, Dimitri?
I think the US is just way too late. I mean, the time to be doing more in the South China Sea in a much more aggressive way was when China was building out the islands and the artificial features. And if you remember, Xi Jinping, I think it was 2015, stood in the Rose Garden with Obama and said, I'm not going to militarize the South China Sea. And then over the next 2 years or so, he did exactly that. So, I mean, what is it that the US is actually trying to accomplish in the South China Sea? How can they push back against China? A lot of what China had wanted to do, they've already done. And so I think the US is, it's been hobbled. At the time when, in the 2000s, when the US was focused on Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars, and after that, the focus on China slid, and suddenly the US woke up and China was doing all of these different things. I just don't know how you can put the genie back in the bottle now.
I also think, just to add quickly to that, I mean, China was angering a lot of those countries with that behavior, and those countries, Vietnam and Thailand, I mean, what do they think about, the United States' ability to sort of back up its tough language, or, even higher military presence there? I don't know that, we had maybe a moment that we would be able to strategize with those countries. I remember Obama went to the Philippines and so on. Of course, Australia and Darwin, I was on those trips where he announced various investments of U.S. military assets to the region, right? That could still happen. But again, China sort of steamrolled all those countries. And as much as they were, they went to international tribunals and so on, and China didn't care, and they sort of showed how, kind of like Trump. I mean, they showed that a lot of institutions and norms that, and international rules, they just didn't ignore them.
But if you think about the one kind of, to me, case study, and I was Asian news editor for the FT at the time, and I heard this from countries all over, particularly Southeast Asia. When the Chinese Coast Guard ships appeared on the Scarborough Shoal, was that 2012, I think? And there was a huge standoff. No American ships showed up on the horizon. And it was at that moment, and I know in Washington, a lot of Democrats will say that this is unfair. But what I heard from many different people in Asia was that showed that the pivot was hollow. when it came down to the crunch, the Americans didn't show up. Therefore, what's the point?
Dimitri, your answer gets at a question that Kevin Mayer posed about how the Biden administration might reassure allies in Asia that they will actually meet security commitments with respect to both Chinese provocations in the East and South China Seas, but also North Korean nuclear missile threats. Do you want to add anything to elaborate to sort of how a Biden administration can show up to give reality to those security assurances? And to David, a question about Japan-Korea relations, because much as the South China Sea is an interesting place, to me, the core of any attempt to balance Chinese influence in the Asia-Pacific begins with having effective US ROK Japan trilateral coordination. And as we all know, the Japan-Korea relationship has been quite strained in recent years. So we have a question from the floor. What can Biden do? What should he do to try to enhance ROK Japan cooperation? So first to you, Dimitri, and then David and Jane.
Well, I mean, let's take an example. What about Chinese ships, getting close or within the waters surrounding the Senkaku or the Diaoyu? Does Japan, I think this is where the complication is. Japan would like the US to make it clear that it supports Japan and will defend Japan. And interestingly, when Biden and Suga talked for the first time, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago, Suga came out in Tokyo and said that Biden had told him that the Mutual Defense Treaty included the Senkaku Islands. When the Biden team here published or released their readout of the call, they talked about the Mutual Defense Treaty, but they didn't mention the Senkaku. Now, if you take it further, let's say the Chinese ships are getting even closer. Does Japan really want American warships showing up near the Senkaku in the vicinity of Chinese ships? I don't think so, because the potential for conflict then becomes real. So again, you have this hugely complicated balancing act. I think the problem is that 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, American rhetoric held more weight because China was less powerful and the US was more consistent. I think that's been reversed. American rhetoric doesn't really have that much weight anymore. So what can you do beyond rhetoric that doesn't then escalate the situation to a point where you risk triggering a conflict that actually no one wants at the end of the day? And I think, again, there are no easy answers.
I would echo that for the other question you posed to me. I mean, I wrote many stories about the difficulty that Obama had in trying to work with South Korea and Seoul and Tokyo. I think, if you even look back to Obama's visit to Hiroshima, I mean, it was a lot of the language there was to a degree talking about, getting over old grievances, making amends. If I can show up here, the United States can be great allies with Japan. Why can't other countries? And, I think there was some language, that I think they included some Korean folks who were injured, if I remember, survivors who had been in Hiroshima, and they had been survivors and so on, and they had made a point to have them there symbolically in Peace Park when Obama made those remarks. I mean, that's a difficult project, though, for a president. How much presidential time can you really think to put into that? And Obama had a trilateral meeting with the 2 other leaders in The Hague, I remember, I think around 2014, and he had another one. Trump, I think, has also had a couple trilaterals because he was trying to galvanize the region on North Korea. And that was his focus more than their own relationship. And I have talked to Trump aides in the NSC and so on, who talked about they were aware of that problem, and they're it really hamstrings U.S. policy to have these 2 allies at each other's throat. But having lived in Japan and having spent time in Korea, I mean, we all know that it's very difficult for America to have a president even to have influence, I think, on bridging that gap. These are old grievances, a lot of domestic politics in both cases. And I don't know how much influence Biden can really have to, he's going to try his best to sort of find common areas, but it's going to be a difficult project.
Jane, a question for you also about melding together allies and how one can try to weave together a fabric of community. A question from Shinichi Isobe about the Quad. Now, there you are in Australia. This was a Trump innovation, Japan, Australia, US, and India, designed, I suppose, in part as a strategic counterweight to the Chinese Belt Road Initiative and growing Chinese clout in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. Do you have a sense of the future of the Quad under Biden? Is this a structure that he is likely to sustain? And pivoting from your question, Jane, to another related question that Dimitri wrote about for the Financial Times, which is that how will the White House organize itself when it thinks about the Indo-Pacific? Will we have a classic East Asia directorate, or might we have an Asia czar which, by the way, if ever there was a Russian word that was inappropriate to the moment, but if are we going to have an Asia czar riding herd on both South Asia policy and East Asia policy to try to bring this Indo-Pacific concept into fruition? But Jane, first about the viability of the Quad under Biden.
Well, if I could, I'll just take the Asia czar first, because
Sure.
It depends who it is. I mean, if it's someone with real clout, I don't know who it would be, maybe. But it sounds like a way actually to fob off Asia into somebody, to somebody who's got a little office in the EOB and, runs around Asia, but doesn't get any entree into the Oval Office. I mean, it sounds like a really bad idea to me, but that's just my personal thing, because I can't imagine who they're going to make.
I was going to suggest Frank for the job, but
Yes,
talk me out of it.
I've got a great job. Thanks very much, David.
Oh, okay.
I mean, unless they make Jake
Get my
Sullivan
good sources in there. Come on.
and for the Quad, I mean, I'm not going to say too much. I don't see a lot of there. If it had some real security dimension and some real military dimension, maybe, but India is a kind of reluctant outlier. Australia and India don't get on. And it's obviously built to contain China, and I'm not sure you can contain China by any means, but certainly not by the Quad. So sorry to sound so negative, but I'm not sure that either the Asia czar or the Quad are very fruitful solutions to the problem.
Frank, if I could just add, because this also ties in some of the other questions, about whether Biden focuses on Europe first, etc. I think one of the difficulties is there are a lot of allies who want to work with the US when it comes to China, obviously Japan, European countries too. They like it in principle, but then when the US gets too tough on China and that exposes them, all of a sudden they don't like it as much. And I think that's one of the challenges, and that addresses, what Jane was saying about the Quad and India as well. On the Asia czar, one of the things they're thinking about is under that person elevating India and making it more prominent. So you'd have a person responsible for India and South Asia, someone for China specifically, and then someone for Japan, Korea, Australia, and the other allies. So that would suggest a little bit more prominence for India. But again, I think a lot of these things, they sound good, but when you ask officials, explain to me in just layman language what it actually achieves and how it has changed behavior. I really never heard anyone give me a good answer and say, Dimitri, this is what we've achieved with this. And so it always feels very pie in the sky to me. And if it feels pie in the sky to me, I'm sure in Beijing it's even more pie in the sky.
I mean, if you think about it, right now under Trump, you have the number 2 at the NSC, who's a China expert, and and Matt Pottinger, and you have Pompeo and these others who think a lot about China. You have an administration that thinks a lot about China. They don't think it's strategically about Asia. We know that, or broadly strategically. And they have a president who is so unpredictable that it's hard to get those policies in place until we've seen this opening now. But yeah, I mean, so that says, like, how would this team, Biden team, think more about China than even the Trump team? And if so, how? And I think adding more layers of bureaucracy is not necessarily a way that is the winning, way to go about it. There may be some fruits to it, but even the way that Dimitri sort of talks about it a little bit then starts to sound almost like what they have with the different directorates and an Asia directorate, already in place. So, we'll see. But
I
again,
always
it comes down to the principles and how much Biden and Harris and others are really going to pay attention.
Notwithstanding my Kennedy School training as a creeping incrementalist, I tend to be skeptical about the graduate school solution to any problem is to create a new job.
Yeah, right.
And so I worry a little bit that if the problem is we don't have a coherent Asia strategy, having an Asia czar is not the solution. The solution is having your senior director for Asia, thrash it out with the senior director for South Asia and the senior director for Latin America and Europe and Middle East, and present the president with a plan that prioritizes Asia correctly and applies the necessary resources to accomplish the objective. And I don't think that process becomes any easier just by having one supernumerary, person atop the bureaucracy whose job it is to do Asia. But that's my personal bias. If I would tell them that less is more, and keep the expertise that you have at the National Security Council closer to the president rather than creating a new layer between them and the Oval Office. This has been a little bit of a depressing conversation, I'm told, by one of the viewers, and which is not a smack on the quality, but only a noted realism and a certain sobriety here among all three of you. I want to ask each of you, as we close out the evening, to give me a white swan, not a black swan bad event, but to imagine some of the positive accomplishments of a Biden first term in Asia. What would success look like? If you're Biden's chronicler, you're writing your book on Biden's first term, Asia policy success stories, what are the chapters that are going to be in that book? What are the possibilities for success for the Biden administration as it engages Asia? Let me start with you, Dimitri. You've studied the campaigns twice. You've studied many American presidents trying to grapple with Asia. What would be some successes within reach for the Biden administration?
I think one success, although it'll sound quite bureaucratic, would be if it was clear to Asia what, in a consistent way, what US policy is for the long term. If somehow Washington could become, now I don't think this is going to happen, but I'm trying to be optimistic, Washington could become less dysfunctional and actually operate as a group of lawmakers and executives and officials who actually want to work in the interest of their country and try and give the new president a chance to do positive things in Asia. But again, I think it's very hard to do that. It is, I mean, we talked about climate change. I think it's going to be difficult, but it is possible that, over time for Beijing, it's going to become more important for Beijing to tackle climate change as well as its own population gets wealthier and starts to focus on, as people become wealthy, they start to focus on different issues, and climate change is one of them. So I think maybe, hopefully there is a possibility to do something there. I think keeping tensions low, whether that's in North Korea or the Taiwan Strait, is super important. And, you can't underestimate the value of that. But I think the idea that there's going to be some huge, success, some big thing that's going to be accomplished in the next 4 years, I think it's hard to imagine what it will be. I think it's managing relationships, getting things back in the right direction, getting more cooperation with China where you can, and pushing back where you need to. But I don't see any big bang results, to be quite frank.
David, any big bangs, any positive outlooks? I once told my daughter, my second daughter, that I didn't know what year there would be peace on the Korean Peninsula, but I knew the date, that it was going to be November 17th, because my older daughter is born on Martin Luther King's birthday, and that's a day of peace. And I'm born on November 11th, which is the day of armistice. And my wife is born on August, the day of victory over Japan, August 14, 15. So the only one in the family who doesn't have a good peace day is my younger daughter. So it's going to be November 17th, but what year? And is there a chance for breakthrough with North Korea? Is the conundrum of the peninsula going to be solved under a Biden administration? Or what other breakthroughs might there be that you can foresee Biden accomplishing in Asia policy?
I'm going to guess that your daughter is going to have to wait probably more than 4 more years, maybe more than 8. So maybe not, maybe a Harris, who knows? But I don't think there's any breakthrough there. I think look, we're in the big moment right now is the coronavirus and the economy. And I think, as much as we talk about all the other problems and things going on, I think that's the immediate thing. That does have a very important global ramification, but also with China. And I think that, not that we're going to have some, la-di-da cooperation and new trust with China, far from it. I think that if we can come out of this crisis, though, with some better consensus about what China's role in this was, what it means for us, how much that means we can't trust China on other big things, or we can, any way that we can, find better ways to manage these kind of, global catastrophes in a way with another emerging power like China going forward. I think that's an important question, and that may be one that's hard to answer. It may be no, maybe we can't. But we see the Trump administration was, all over the map with this, and they don't think that we can trust them anymore. And I think that for Biden, if he's going to try to test that proposition, this would be the most important thing that we can do in the near-term future.
And Jane, you're going to get.
What about if Biden tapped Trump to be his North Korean boy?
Well, that would be a bold choice.
Lots of trips right there to Pyongyang.
Could they send him on a one-way plane ride to Pyongyang? That could be a win-win for Biden and North Korea.
He might build like a seaside resort there.
Well, that Pyramid Tower hotel building in Pyongyang needs a redevelopment scheme. So that could be a work of a lifetime right there. Jane, I'm going to give you the last word, and you have to just promise to come up with something optimistic. So
Okay.
tell us about a success that you would like to see or that you think might be within range for a Biden first term, maybe even as something as modest as helping to secure the U.S.-Australian friendship for another 100 years.
I don't think that's too difficult. I agree with Dimitri that a more cohesive U.S., a United States that looks more successful at home will go a long, long, long way in Asia. And I do think that, David just said, well, the United States, American people can't trust China anymore. Well, look, we didn't trust the USSR either, but there were summits and there were talks. There was contact between the two sides. I get the distinct impression there's no meaningful talk between Beijing and Washington, and that's very dangerous. And I think that Biden, given his personality and his understanding of Xi, despite all the difficulties, does have the opportunity to create a kind of stability, a floor under the relationship between the two leaders. And I think that's something that could be very positive. No one expects the United States and China to suddenly trust each other. It's not going to happen. They're sort of, competing against each other to the death, but there has to be a floor under the relationship. And I think given Biden's personality, a good relationship or a stable relationship with Xi would be something to go for, and I would think would be achievable.
Well, I want to echo that, Jane. I have seen Biden in his interactions with senior Chinese leaders in the past. I've seen John Kerry do the same with Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang earlier. And I think that there is something to be said for reliable, coherent, stable leadership in Washington as a vehicle to improve relations, even with countries with whom we have so many differences. And so I think it's an optimistic note on which to close that a Biden administration with its professional, no malarkey, hopefully steadier approach may provide some strategic reassurance, not so much just to Beijing, maybe, but to all of Asia, that even if the United States is not back in some dramatic fashion, that the United States is a more reliable and trustworthy partner going forward, and that they can have fewer surprises and fewer shock by tweet mornings to look forward to in a Biden administration. I want to thank all three of you, old friends, for joining me this evening for a really wonderful discussion about US and Asia. I want to thank the 150 some odd participants. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of your questions, but it was a very learned audience full of people who have long devoted time to US-Asia relations. And I hope that you enjoyed it. Check out other programming of the Mansfield Foundation at our website, www.mansfieldfdn.org. Please join me in expressing special thanks to Dimitri, David, and Jane Thank you so much, guys, gals,
Thank you.
and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.